Meet Dana Brooks, a highly skilled airline pilot who spent years proving she belongs in the cockpit. On a routine flight from Los Angeles to New York, Dana faces open prejudice from a passenger who refuses to trust her abilities because of her race and gender. But as an unexpected storm threatens the safety of everyone on board, Dana's skills and composure are put to the ultimate test. Can she rise above the doubts and save the day, or will the storm and the prejudice be too much to handle? If you enjoy stories of resilience and overcoming challenges, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below. What would you do in Dana's situation? Let's get into this powerful story of determination in the face of adversity. The alarm clock buzzed in the pre-dawn quiet, vibrating the nightstand beside Dana Brooks' bed. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking away the remnants of a dream, and reached out to silence the persistent noise. Outside her window, the early morning was still dark, the only light coming from distant street lamps and the faint glow of Los Angeles preparing to wake up. Dana sat up, stretched, and rolled her neck, feeling the familiar tightness in her shoulders from years of long flights and early mornings. This was her routine: wake up before the world, get ready in the silence, and head to the airport for another day in the skies. But today, there was a faint sense of unease she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the weather forecast she'd glanced at the night before, predicting a storm system over the Midwest. Or maybe it was just the weight of the day ahead. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, walking into the bathroom where the light flickered on automatically. Her face stared back at her from the mirror, calm, composed, with a hint of tiredness beneath her sharp brown eyes. Dana splashed cold water on her face and then quickly tied her dark, curly hair into a neat bun. It was a simple ritual she'd perfected over years of flying, a small act of control before stepping into the unpredictable world of aviation. Back in her bedroom, she slid on her crisp navy blue pilot's uniform. The fabric was always freshly pressed, sharp lines forming across her shoulders and down her legs. She stood in front of the mirror, her reflection now looking more like the captain she knew herself to be. With a quiet sense of pride, she picked up her silver wings from her dresser and pinned them carefully to her chest, just above her heart. Those wings represented everything she had fought for, every late night of studying, every flight hour logged, every doubter she'd silenced with her skill and determination. Her phone buzzed with a message: Eric, her co-pilot, confirming that he was already at the airport. He was always early, and though they were close colleagues, Eric never missed a chance to tease her about her last-minute, but always on-time routine. Dana smiled as she texted back a simple, "On my way." She grabbed her bag and keys, casting one last glance around her small but cozy apartment. The photos on her mantel caught her eye, one of her family, on the day she graduated from flight school. Her parents beaming with pride beside her in her uniform. They had supported her every step of the way, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against her. Growing up, Dana had always been fascinated by planes. Her father, a retired Navy pilot, had sparked that fascination, taking her to air shows and sharing stories from his days in the cockpit. Her mother had been the one to teach her resilience, to never let anyone tell her she couldn't do something because of the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman. "Today's just another flight," Dana muttered to herself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach. But deep down, she knew today would be different. She stepped out into the cool morning air, locking her door behind her. The city was still quiet, the streets nearly empty as her car hummed to life. The drive to the airport was familiar, a route she could take with her eyes closed. But as she merged onto the freeway, her mind drifted to the challenges she'd faced to get here. Being a black female pilot wasn't common, and she had faced her fair share of doubters along the way: professors, colleagues, passengers, all of them questioning whether she really belonged in the cockpit. But Dana had never let that stop her. She loved flying too much to let anyone take it away from her. The airport came into view, its lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. Dana parked in the employee lot, grabbed her flight bag, and made her way inside. LAX was already buzzing with early morning travelers, dragging suitcases, clutching coffee cups, and moving through security with a kind of sleepy efficiency. The familiar sounds of announcements over the PA system and the hum of conversation surrounded her as she walked through the terminal. Her uniform drew the usual mix of reactions from passengers, curious glances, polite smiles, and the occasional double-take. It wasn't every day that they saw a black woman wearing pilot's wings. Dana had grown accustomed to the stares over the years, brushing them off with the same calm professionalism she used in the cockpit. As she passed through security, she mentally ran through her pre-flight checklist: weather conditions, flight plan, fuel levels, emergency procedures. Everything had to be perfect. Dana always made sure of that. Flying was her passion, but it was also a serious responsibility. Every time she stepped into that cockpit, dozens of lives were in her hands, and she didn't take that lightly. She reached the gate for Flight 297, bound for New York. The plane was waiting on the tarmac, its sleek body gleaming under the airport lights. Dana felt the familiar thrill of excitement build in her chest. No matter how many times she did this, the sight of a plane always gave her a rush. This was what she was meant to do. But as she neared the gate, something caught her eye: a woman sitting in the waiting area, watching her with a sharp, disapproving gaze. Dana noticed the woman's well-coiffed blonde hair, styled into a perfect bob, and the expensive-looking coat draped over her lap. She looked to be in her mid-50s, and her expression was one of thinly veiled contempt. "Are you kidding me?" the woman muttered, loud enough for Dana to hear as she walked past. Dana's steps faltered slightly, but she didn't stop. She had heard comments like that before, barely concealed disbelief or disapproval from passengers who weren't used to seeing a black female pilot. Most of the time they said nothing, just stared with quiet judgment. But this woman, she seemed different, bolder, more entitled. Dana continued walking, focusing on her pre-flight routine, but she could feel the woman's eyes boring into her back. The sense of unease she had felt earlier that morning deepened. As Dana approached the gate, she pulled out her tablet, ready to check the flight details one last time. But before she could focus on her screen, she heard the woman's voice again, louder this time. "Excuse me?" Dana turned slowly, finding the blonde woman standing now, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was set in a look of cold disdain. "Can I help you?" Dana asked, her voice steady despite the anger starting to bubble up inside her. "You mean to tell me you're the pilot for this flight?" the woman demanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked Dana up and down, clearly unimpressed. "Yes, Mom," Dana replied, keeping her tone calm and professional. "I'm the captain of this flight." The woman scoffed, her lips curling in a sneer. "There's no way I'm getting on a plane that's being flown by someone like you." Dana felt her stomach tighten, but she maintained her composure. She had dealt with people like this before, people who couldn't see beyond the color of her skin or her gender, who thought she didn't belong in the captain's seat. It never got easier, but she had learned how to handle it. "I assure you, Mom, I'm fully qualified to fly this plane," Dana said, her voice even but firm. "If you have any concerns, you're welcome to speak to the gate agent." "I don't need to speak to anyone else," the woman snapped, her voice growing louder. "I want to speak to the real pilot." "Where is he?" Dana's grip tightened around her tablet, but before she could respond, her co-pilot, Eric Williams, appeared beside her. Eric was tall, with sandy blonde hair and a calm demeanor that always seemed to put passengers at ease. He had been flying with Dana for the past year, and they had developed a strong professional bond. As soon as Eric saw the tension between Dana and the woman, his expression hardened. "Is there a problem here?" Eric asked, his voice cool but firm. The woman's eyes lit up when she saw Eric, as if she had finally found the person she had been looking for. "Yes, there is a problem," she said, pointing at Dana. "I don't feel comfortable flying with her as the captain." "This is ridiculous." Eric's jaw clenched, but he remained composed. "Mom, Captain Brooks is one of the most skilled pilots I've had the pleasure of flying with. If you have any concerns, I suggest you reconsider them." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but Eric cut her off. "You're welcome to file a complaint if you feel it's necessary, but Captain Brooks will be flying this plane." The woman's face flushed with anger, and for a moment Dana thought she might continue arguing. But instead, she huffed, crossed her arms even tighter, and stormed onto the plane without another word. Dana exhaled slowly, the tension in her body slowly easing. She glanced at Eric, grateful for his support. "Thanks," she said quietly. Eric shrugged, offering her a small smile. "You shouldn't have to deal with that kind of nonsense," he said. "People like her, they don't get it." Dana nodded, though the sting of the woman's words lingered. "Yeah," she muttered. "They don't." As Dana and Eric boarded the plane, the weight of the day settled over her. She had faced situations like this before, but each time it happened, it left a scar. No matter how many times she proved herself, there were always people who doubted her, people like Susan Caldwell, whose judgment was clouded by prejudice. But today, like every other day, Dana reminded herself that she had a job to do. She wasn't going to let one person's ignorance derail her focus. She was a pilot. She belonged here, and she was going to fly. As Dana walked into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the instruments surrounded her, a steady reminder of the control she had over the plane and the safety of her passengers. The air inside the cockpit was cool, and she breathed in deeply, feeling the tension begin to leave her body. Here she could focus. Here, there were no distractions, just her and the controls. Eric followed her in, setting his flight bag down beside his seat. He glanced at her, reading the frustration still etched on her face. "You good?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. Dana nodded as she sat down in the captain's seat, adjusting her headset and buckling in. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. Eric didn't push, but Dana could sense that he wasn't entirely convinced. He had seen her deal with difficult passengers before, but today's encounter had been particularly harsh. Dana wasn't just dealing with a rude comment or a dismissive glance, she had been openly challenged, her ability questioned simply because of who she was. "People like that woman," Eric said after a moment, shaking his head. "They don't see the work you've put in. They don't see the hours, the dedication. They just see what they want to see." Dana exhaled slowly, her hands tightening on the yoke. "Yeah, but it doesn't make it any easier." Eric looked at her, his expression softening. "No, it doesn't. But you've proven yourself, Dana, over and over again." Dana glanced at him, grateful for his words, but still feeling the weight of the encounter. "Thanks, Eric. I just wish I didn't have to keep proving it." Eric gave her a small smile, then turned his attention to the pre-flight checklist. "You shouldn't have to," he said simply, but the unspoken truth hung in the air between them. This was the world they lived in, a world where Dana, despite her skill and experience, would always have to prove herself just a little bit more than others. Dana knew that. She had known it for years. But some days, like today, it was harder to brush off. She took a deep breath and pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. The flight was set to take off in 20 minutes, and there were still pre-flight checks to complete. Dana ran through her mental checklist, ensuring that everything was in order: fuel levels, navigation systems, engine performance. Every detail had to be perfect. Flying was her passion, and no matter what challenges she faced, she always found comfort in the routine, in the precision required to make each flight a success. Here, in the cockpit, she was in control. The doubts, the prejudice, none of that mattered up here. As they finished the final checks, the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for takeoff. Dana glanced at the small screen displaying the passengers, watching as they settled into their seats. She spotted Megan Rivera, the head flight attendant, moving up and down the aisle, assisting passengers with their luggage and offering her usual bright smile. Megan had been part of Dana's crew for nearly 2 years, and the two had formed a close bond during their flights together. Megan's upbeat personality and quick wit always helped lighten the mood, even during stressful situations. "Ready for another adventure?" Captain Megan asked, as she poked her head into the cockpit, her eyes twinkling with the same playful energy that had endeared her to so many passengers over the years. Dana smiled, grateful for the brief moment of levity. "Always," she replied, her voice more confident now. Megan nodded, giving Dana a thumbs up. "We're all set back here, just waiting on you two." Eric gave a mock salute. Well, get this bird in the air in no time. Megan grinned and disappeared back into the cabin, leaving Dana and Eric alone in the cockpit once more. As the final boarding call went out over the PA system, Dana's thoughts drifted back to the woman in first class, Susan Caldwell. She could picture her sitting there, still fuming over the fact that Dana was the one flying the plane. Dana knew there were others like her, passengers who might not say anything out loud, but still harbored the same doubts. She could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at her as if questioning whether she really belonged in that seat. But Dana had learned to rise above it. She had spent her entire career proving those doubts wrong, time and time again. And today would be no different. With all passengers now seated, Dana and Eric began the process of preparing for takeoff. The familiar sounds of the engines powering up filled the cockpit, a steady hum that always brought a sense of calm to Dana's mind. She and Eric ran through the final checks, their movements synchronized from years of working together. "Engines good?" Eric asked, his eyes scanning the controls. "Good," Dana confirmed. "Everything's looking smooth." Eric glanced at her, a small smile on his face. "Ready to fly?" Dana returned the smile, her earlier frustration melting away as the thrill of flying took over. "Always." She pushed the throttle forward, feeling the power of the engine surge through the plane as it began to move down the runway. The roar of the engines filled the cabin, the ground speeding past them in a blur of lights as the plane gained speed. For Dana, takeoff was always the most exhilarating part of the flight. It was the moment when the plane broke free from the earth, defying gravity as it soared into the sky. It was a feeling of pure control, of freedom. As the wheels left the ground and the plane lifted into the air, Dana felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was what she lived for. Up here, in the sky, she was in her element. Nothing else mattered. The city lights of Los Angeles grew smaller beneath them as the plane climbed higher, breaking through the early morning clouds. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the horizon. "We're at cruising altitude," Dana announced after a few minutes, her voice calm and steady. Eric nodded, his hands moving over the controls as they adjusted the plane's course. "All systems are good. Looks like we're in for a smooth flight." Dana leaned back slightly, allowing herself to relax now that the plane was safely in the air. The hum of the engines was soothing, a constant reminder of the power she commanded. This was where she felt most at home, in the cockpit, thousands of feet above the ground, in control of her destiny. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign blinked off, Dana glanced at the radar, checking the weather ahead. Clear skies for now, though she knew there were reports of turbulence later in the flight. Nothing she couldn't handle. Behind her, the passengers were settling in for the long flight to New York. Megan and the other flight attendants were already moving through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks. Dana could imagine the passengers, some reading, others sleeping, and a few probably tapping away on their laptops, already lost in work. But among them, Dana knew, was Susan Caldwell, likely still fuming in her first-class seat. Dana hadn't seen her again since the confrontation at the gate, but she could feel the woman's presence, a simmering tension that hung in the air. Dana sighed, pushing the thought aside. She had a flight to command, and she wasn't going to let one difficult passenger ruin her day. She had dealt with worse before, and she would deal with this too. As the plane cruised smoothly through the clear skies, Dana allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of the flight. This was where she belonged, up here in the clouds, free from the doubts and prejudices that tried to weigh her down on the ground. She was a pilot.
And today she was going to fly.
The hum of the engines filled the cockpit as Dana Brooks settled into the rhythm of the flight. At 35,000 feet, Flight 297 cruised through clear skies, the early morning sun now fully risen, casting golden light across the horizon. Dana scanned the instruments, confirming that everything was functioning smoothly. They were halfway across the country now, with New York still hours away, but so far, it had been a textbook-perfect flight. Eric Williams, her co-pilot, leaned back in his chair, sipping from a cup of coffee. He glanced at Dana, who had remained mostly quiet since takeoff. "Looks like it's going to be an easy one," he said, stretching his arms. "No complaints here." Dana offered a small smile but didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts were still lingering on the encounter with Susan Caldwell at the gate. Even now, hours into the flight, she could feel the weight of the woman's disapproval pressing on her. It wasn't the first time someone had challenged her ability to be in command, but today had felt different. Susan's outright refusal to trust her had been more direct, more personal than the sideways glances or quiet whispers Dana had become used to. She had expected those things when she first started flying commercially. After all, she was a black woman in a field still dominated by white men, but that didn't make it easier to swallow. "You're still thinking about her? Aren't you?" Eric's voice cut through her thoughts. Dana blinked, then shrugged. "Yeah, I guess I am," she admitted, keeping her eyes on the horizon. "Don't let it get to you," Eric said, setting his coffee down. "People like her, they don't get it. But you don't owe her, or anyone else, an explanation. You're here because you earned it. Plain and simple." Dana exhaled slowly, her grip on the controls relaxing just slightly. Eric's words were a comfort, but the sting of Susan's earlier comments still lingered. She had always known she'd face people like Susan, and she had long since developed the thick skin necessary to brush them off. But even the thickest armor could wear thin after years of enduring the same prejudice. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. "I'm good," Dana said. "Let's just focus on getting this bird to New York." Eric nodded, sensing that she didn't want to dwell on it any longer. He turned his attention back to the radar, scanning for any weather disturbances ahead. "Everything looks clear so far," he said. "Should be smooth sailing all the way through." Dana glanced at the radar as well, confirming what Eric had said. The sky ahead was clear, and there were no signs of turbulence or storms in their immediate path. It was shaping up to be a calm flight, and for a moment, Dana allowed herself to relax. In the cabin, the passengers were quiet, most of them already settled into their routines for the flight. Some were napping, others reading or watching movies on their screens. Megan Rivera and the other flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks with their usual bright smiles. Dana's mind wandered for a moment, thinking about how different life was in the skies compared to the world on the ground. Up here, everything was so controlled, so precise. There were rules, procedures, and protocols, all designed to keep things running smoothly. But down on the ground, it was messier. People let their biases and prejudices dictate their actions, creating obstacles that shouldn't exist. Flying had always been Dana's escape from that. Up here, she was in control. Up here, she could rise above it all. But today, even in the air, the weight of those biases followed her. The plane continued its smooth path across the country, and Dana began to ease into the familiar rhythm of the flight. The soft whir of the engines and the gentle sway of the plane as it cut through the clouds were comforting, reminding her why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. Up here, above the world, everything seemed simpler, more peaceful. Eric glanced at her, sensing the change in her mood. "Feeling better?" Dana nodded. "Yeah, just needed a minute to clear my head." "Good," Eric said with a smile. "Because we've got a long way to go." Dana chuckled softly, her earlier tension easing. She checked the instruments again, ensuring that everything was functioning as it should. As she did, her thoughts drifted back to her early days in flight school. She had been one of only a handful of women in her class, and the only black woman. From day one, Dana had known that her journey would be more difficult than her peers. While others seemed to glide through the program with ease, she had to prove herself at every step. The instructors were tough on her, and some of her classmates doubted her abilities, openly questioning whether she was cut out for the demanding world of aviation. But Dana had never backed down from a challenge. She had worked twice as hard, pushing herself through the long nights of studying, the grueling flight hours, and the constant pressure to be perfect. And in the end, she had emerged at the top of her class on achievement that no one could take away from her. Still, even with all her success, there had always been people like Susan Caldwell. People who saw her skin color, her gender, and made snap judgments about her competence. It didn't matter how many hours she had logged, how many flawless flights she had piloted, there would always be those who doubted her. Dana sighed, her fingers tapping lightly on the yoke. You ever wonder if things will change? She asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Eric glanced at her, his brow furrowed slightly. What do you mean? Dana hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I mean people like her. People who see someone like me in this uniform and automatically assume I don't belong. You think that'll ever change? Eric was silent for a moment, clearly considering her question. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had witnessed it himself, seen the way passengers reacted differently to Dana than they did to him. Eric had always been supportive, never questioning her abilities, but even he couldn't fully understand what it was like to walk in her shoes. I'd like to think it will, Eric said finally. But it's slow. Way too slow. People like her, they're stuck in a mindset that's hard to break. But you're changing it, Dana. Just by being here, by doing what you do, you're changing it. Dana gave him a grateful smile, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Change was slow, painfully so, and while she had seen progress over the years, there were still days like today when it felt like nothing had changed at all. But she had learned long ago not to let those doubts consume her. She had come too far, worked too hard, to let the opinions of a few small-minded people hold her back. We're gonna get there, Eric added, his voice filled with quiet determination. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but we'll get there. Dana nodded, though a part of her still wondered how many more flights like this she would have to endure before that day came. Several hours had passed since the flight had left Los Angeles, and the plane was now flying over the Midwest. Outside the windows, the sky had begun to change, with thick clouds rolling in from the west. Dana noticed the shift immediately, her eyes narrowing as she checked the radar. Looks like we've got some weather ahead, Eric said, his tone suddenly serious. Dana nodded, her fingers moving quickly over the controls as she adjusted their course slightly. Yeah, I see it. Shouldn't be too bad, but we might hit some turbulence. She radioed air traffic control to confirm the weather conditions ahead, listening carefully as they gave her updated information. The storm system was moving faster than expected, and while it wasn't a major concern yet, they would need to keep a close eye on it. Dana's hands tightened on the yoke as she felt the first slight jolt of turbulence. It wasn't unusual, just a brief shudder as the plane entered the edges of the storm, but it was enough to remind her that they were at the mercy of the weather. In the cabin, the passengers were beginning to notice the change as well. The once calm atmosphere had shifted, with nervous glances exchanged between some of the passengers. Dana could hear the faint murmur of voices from the intercom, and she knew that the flight attendants would be preparing to secure the cabin for what might be a rough patch ahead. Then came the voice she had been dreading. "What's going on?" Susan Caldwell's panicked voice rang out from the first-class cabin. Dana could hear the edge of fear in her words, but there was also something else blame. As if Susan believed the turbulence was somehow Dana's fault. "We're going to crash." Susan's voice rose, shrill and panicked, as the plane shook again. Dana's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had dealt with panicked passengers before, but Susan's voice grated on her nerves in a way that no other passengers had. "Ignore her," Eric said quietly, his eyes still focused on the instruments. "You've got this." Dana nodded, her hands steady on the controls. The turbulence was getting worse now, the plane shuddering as it pushed through the storm. She could hear the rising panic in the cabin behind her, the voices growing louder as the plane dipped and swayed in the rough air. But Dana didn't let it distract her. She had been through worse storms than this. She knew how to handle it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Dana's voice rang out through the cabin, calm and steady despite the turbulence. "We are experiencing some unexpected weather, but please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are taking every precaution to ensure your safety, and we will be through this shortly." Her voice was practiced, reassuring, but Dana could feel the tension in her chest growing. The storm ahead was stronger than she had anticipated, and the plane was struggling against the fierce winds. "We need to drop altitude," Dana said to Eric, her voice low but firm. "The winds are worse up here. We'll be safer if we descend." Eric nodded, already adjusting the controls. "I trust you." Dana appreciated his unwavering support, but the weight of the storm was pressing down on her. She knew the passengers were terrified. She could hear it in their voices, feel it in the way the plane shook with every gust of wind. And Susan's panicked cries only added to the pressure. For a moment, Dana felt the weight of the entire flight on her shoulders. Every life on board was her responsibility, and she couldn't let anything go wrong. "Focus," she muttered to herself, her hands moving quickly over the controls as the plane began to descend. "We've got this." The turbulence intensified, shaking the plane with increasing violence. Dana's heart raced as she fought to keep the aircraft stable, her hands gripping the yoke tightly. The storm had come out of nowhere, faster and more powerful than the forecasts had predicted. It was as if the sky itself had turned against them, and Dana knew she was in for a battle. "Looks like we've got a monster on our hands," Eric muttered, his eyes glued to the radar. The storm system ahead was massive, its swirling clouds stretching as far as the eye could see. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the dark sky with eerie brightness. Dana's hands moved quickly over the controls, adjusting their altitude and speed, trying to find the safest path through the storm. The winds were fierce, buffeting the plane from all sides, and the turbulence was relentless. In the cabin, the passengers were panicking. Dana could hear them over the intercom, their voices rising in fear as the plane shook violently. And above them all, she could hear Susan Caldwell, her voice loud and frantic. "We're going to crash. Someone needs to stop this." Dana gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to let the panic in the cabin affect her. She had a job to do, and that job was to get everyone on this plane to New York safely. "We need to get out of this," Dana said, her voice tight with concentration. "We're dropping too fast." Eric nodded, his hands steady on the controls as he followed her lead. "I'm with you." The plane shuddered again, and Dana's heart skipped a beat as she saw the altimeter drop rapidly. They were losing altitude too quickly, and the storm wasn't letting up. "Come on," Dana muttered under her breath, her hands gripping the yoke as she fought to stabilize the plane. "Hold together." She glanced at Eric, who was focused entirely on the instruments. "We need to climb. It's our only option." Eric didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." Dana pulled back on the controls, forcing the plane to climb higher. The engines roared in protest, straining against the powerful winds, but slowly, agonizingly slowly, the plane began to rise. The turbulence was worse at higher altitudes, but Dana knew it was their only chance. The storm was too dangerous at lower levels, and if they didn't find a way out of it soon, they could be in serious trouble. The plane bucked and swayed as it climbed, the winds howling around them like a living force. Dana's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was racing. She had been through storms before, but this one felt different, more intense, more dangerous. For a few heart-stopping moments, it felt as though the plane might not make it. The engines strained, the wings shook, and the turbulence was so violent that Dana could barely keep the plane level. But then, slowly, they began to break through. With a final shudder, the plane emerged from the storm, breaking through the thick clouds and into clear skies. The turbulence subsided, and the winds died down, leaving only the steady hum of the engines as the plane leveled off. Dana exhaled deeply, her muscles aching from the tension of the last few minutes. She had done it. They had made it through. Eric let out a long breath beside her, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Good job, Captain," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You handled that like a pro." Dana managed a small smile, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. "Thanks," she said quietly, her hands still gripping the yoke tightly. She could hear the murmurs of relief from the cabin behind her, the passengers finally beginning to calm down after the harrowing ordeal. A few of them even clapped softly, a sign of their gratitude for making it through the storm safely. Dana leaned back in her seat, allowing herself a moment to breathe. The storm had been one of the worst she had ever flown through, and the weight of the responsibility she carried was still heavy on her shoulders. But they had made it. She had done her job. As the plane settled into a smooth cruise once again, Dana glanced at Eric, who was already checking the instruments to ensure that everything was back to normal. "You all right?" Eric asked, his tone gentle. Dana nodded, though the exhaustion was clear in her eyes. "Yeah, just glad it's over." Eric smiled. "You did great. That storm didn't stand a chance. Dana appreciated his words, but inside, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, pride, exhaustion, but also a lingering sense of unease. The storm had passed, but the emotional toll of the day still weighed on her. As they began their descent toward New York, Dana's thoughts drifted back to Susan Caldwell, the woman who had doubted her from the start. Susan had been convinced that Dana wasn't fit to be the captain of this flight, but Dana had proven her wrong. But proving herself, time and time again, it was exhausting. Dana sighed, her hands relaxing on the controls as the lights of New York City came into view in the distance. The storm was over, but the journey was. The Boeing 737 slowed as it rolled smoothly toward the gate at JFK International Airport, the bright terminal lights cutting through the early evening dusk. Inside the cockpit, Dana Brooks exhaled slowly, her fingers relaxing around the yoke as the plane finally came to a stop. The long flight was over. The storm had passed, both outside and within her, but the emotional weight of the day still pressed down on her like a heavy invisible force. "Nice job, Captain," Eric said, his voice warm and sincere. He leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms with a sigh of relief. "I think you just gave that storm a run for its money." Dana managed a tired smile, though her body still buzzed with the residual adrenaline from the harrowing moments in the storm. She had guided the plane and its passengers through one of the worst flights of her career, but she couldn't shake the lingering exhaustion that tugged at her mind and body. "Thanks," Dana replied quietly. "We made it through." Eric looked at her, sensing that the victory was as sweet for her as it should have been. He knew the day had been emotionally taxing, even without the storm. Susan Caldwell's outright dismissal of Dana's abilities at the start of the flight had been more than just a random incident, reflected a much larger struggle Dana faced every day in her career. As a black woman in a predominantly white and male field, Dana had always known that proving herself wasn't a one-time task, it was a constant, unrelenting battle. "You did more than that," Eric said, his voice softer now. "You kept this plane and everyone on it safe. You're one hell of a pilot, Dana. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Dana nodded, grateful for his words, but too tired to express it fully. She glanced out the cockpit window, watching as ground crew members busied themselves around the plane, preparing for the next flight. She could see the passengers starting to gather their belongings, the sound of overhead bins opening, and the hum of conversation filtering in from the cabin. In a few minutes, the passengers would be disembarking, and Dana would have to stand by the cockpit door, as she always did, to greet them and offer a professional smile. Most of them would offer polite nods or murmurs of thanks, as they always did. But Dana knew that today, there would be one passenger in particular whose reaction she wasn't looking forward to: Susan Caldwell. Dana hadn't seen her since the beginning of the flight, but she knew the woman's panic during the storm had likely only cemented her earlier distrust of Dana's abilities. No matter how smoothly the landing had gone, or how skillfully Dana had navigated through the storm, people like Susan were often unwilling to change their minds. Dana took a deep breath, bracing herself. "Let's get through this." Eric stood, grabbing his flight bag and giving her a supportive nod. "He'll be right behind you. We've got this." Together they made their way to the cockpit door, where they would face the passengers as they disembarked. Dana stood tall, her uniform crisp, her captain's wings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She had worked for years to earn those wings, and despite the exhaustion tugging at her, she refused to let the day's events diminish her pride. The door opened, and the passengers began to file out, many of them still shaken from the turbulent flight. Some offered Dana nervous smiles as they passed, and a few murmured quiet words of gratitude. "Thank you, Captain. Great landing. Glad you got us through that storm." Dana nodded in acknowledgement, offering a polite smile in return. Her professionalism never wavered, even as she saw the strain and relief in their faces. And then came Susan Caldwell. Susan hesitated at the front of the line, clutching her purse tightly to her chest as she approached the cockpit door. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was no longer as pristine as it had been when she boarded the flight, and her face was pale, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Dana stood calmly, her expression unreadable, waiting to see what Susan would say if she said anything at all. For a moment, Susan seemed unsure of herself, her gaze flickering between Dana and Eric. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if struggling to find the right words. Dana waited, her hands folded neatly in front of her, projecting the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the flight. Finally, Susan spoke, her voice much quieter than before. I was wrong about you." The words hung in the air between them, surprising Dana more than she cared to admit. She hadn't expected an apology, certainly not from someone like Susan. People like her rarely acknowledged their mistakes, especially not so soon after making them. Susan swallowed hard, her face flushing slightly with embarrassment. I thought," she trailed off, her eyes darting to the floor. "I thought you weren't supposed to be here. But you saved us. You saved my life." Dana stared at her, the moment stretching out in silence. Susan's words were laced with a mixture of shame and gratitude, but Dana couldn't help but wonder if the woman would have ever admitted her mistake, if not for the life-threatening storm that had shaken them all. Did it take near disaster for people like Susan to finally see beyond their prejudices? Dana's mind raced, but outwardly she remained composed. "I was just doing my job," she said softly, her voice even but firm. Susan looked up, her expression a mixture of relief and guilt. "Still thank you. For everything." Dana nodded, not offering any more than that. She didn't need Susan's thanks, nor did she need her apology. Dana had proven herself time and time again, not just to people like Susan, but to herself, and that was what mattered. Susan lingered for a moment longer before finally stepping off the plane, her posture stiff with the weight of her shame. As she disappeared into the terminal, Dana felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her: relief, anger, sadness, and perhaps just a sliver of hope. Hope that people like Susan could change, if only for a moment. Eric stepped up beside her, watching as the last of the passengers disembarked. "Well, that was something." "Yeah," Dana said quietly, her mind still processing the interaction. "It was." Eric glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay?" Dana shrugged, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't quite released. "I don't know. I don't get it. Why does it take something like a storm for someone like her to admit she was wrong? Why can't people just see what's in front of them?" Eric was silent for a moment, considering her words. "Because it's easier to stick with what they know. It's easier to judge someone based on what they think they know, rather than take the time to actually see them for who they are." Dana sighed, her hands falling to her sides as she stared out into the empty terminal. "Yeah, but I'm tired of always having to prove myself. It never stops." Eric nodded, his expression softening. "I know. But today, you didn't just prove yourself, you saved lives, including hers. And whether she realizes it or not, you made a difference." Dana wasn't sure if she believed that, but she appreciated Eric's words all the same. "Thanks, Eric." "Any time," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're the best captain I've ever flown with, and don't let anyone, especially people like her, make you doubt that." Dana smiled, though the weariness in her eyes was still there. "Thanks." Together they gathered their things and prepared to leave the plane. The storm was over, and the flight was done, but the emotional toll of the day still weighed heavily on Dana's mind. As they walked through the terminal, the sounds of the airport buzzed around them, announcements over the intercom, the shuffle of travelers heading to their gates, the distant hum of airplanes taking off and landing. Life moved forward, just as it always did. But for Dana, today had been a reminder that some things hadn't changed as much as she'd hoped. The walk through JFK's bustling terminal was a familiar one for Dana. As she and Eric made their way toward the crew lounge, the noise of the airport surrounded them, passengers hurrying to catch connecting flights, flight attendants chatting in small groups, and the occasional rumble of a plane taking off in the distance. It was the kind of controlled chaos that Dana had grown used to over the years. But today, something felt different. The storm they had flown through had shaken more than just the plane. It had rattled Dana's sense of balance. The confrontation with Susan Caldwell at the beginning of the flight still lingered in her mind, clashing with the woman's awkward apology at the end. "Want to grab a drink?" Eric asked as they approached the crew lounge. "You've earned it after today." Dana chuckled softly, though her smile was tinged with exhaustion. "I think I've earned more than just one drink." Eric laughed, holding the door open for her. "Fair enough. Well, make it two." The crew lounge was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the terminal outside. Dana and Eric found a small table near the back, away from the few other pilots and crew members scattered throughout the room. Eric ordered drinks from the bar while Dana sat, finally allowing herself to relax for the first time since the plane had landed. When Eric returned with their drinks, he set them down on the table and took a seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the shared understanding of what they had just been through. Eric broke the silence first, leaning forward slightly. "So you want to talk about it?" Dana looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "Which part, the storm or Susan?" "Both," Eric said with a small smile. "But let's start with Susan." Dana sighed, taking a sip of her drink before responding. "I don't know, Eric. I don't get it. I've been doing this for years, and I've dealt with people like her before. But today, it just hit me harder." Eric nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It makes sense. We've been flying together for a while now, and I've seen the way some passengers look at you. But today was different. She didn't just question you, she flat-out refused to trust you." Dana's jaw tightened slightly. "Yeah, and it took a life-threatening storm for her to admit she was wrong. It's exhausting, Eric. Having to prove myself over and over again, no matter how many flights I've flown, no matter how many lives I've kept safe. It's like people will always see me as the exception, not the rule." Eric leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "You're right. It's not fair, and it shouldn't be that way. But the fact that you keep showing up, that you keep proving them wrong, that's what makes you exceptional, Dana. You're not just a pilot, you're a damn good one. And you're changing the way people think, even if it's slower than it should be." Dana appreciated his words, but the exhaustion she felt went deeper than the physical. It was the weariness that came from years of fighting against other people's perceptions, of carrying the burden of representation for so many others like her, who were trying to break into the field. "It's just tiring, you know," Dana said quietly. "I love flying, but some days, it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Eric reached across the table, resting a hand on her arm. "You're not losing, Dana.
You're winning every time you step into that cockpit.
And people like Susan, they may not always get it right away, but you're planting seeds. You're changing minds, even if it's not immediate." Dana smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. "Maybe you're right." "I know I'm right," Eric said with a grin. "And besides, you've got a whole lot of people, myself included, who believe in you. So don't let one bad apple spoil the whole bunch." Dana chuckled, the weight on her chest lightening just a little. "Thanks, Eric. I needed that." "Any time," he said, raising his glass. "To surviving storms both in the air and on the ground." Dana raised her glass, clinking it against his. "To rising above." Later that night, after Dana had returned to her apartment in New York, the city lights twinkled through the large windows of her living room. The quiet hum of the traffic below was a comforting reminder that life went on, no matter what turbulence the day had brought. Dana sat on the edge of her bed, her mind still processing everything that had happened. She thought about the storm, about Susan Caldwell, and about all the passengers whose lives she had helped protect that day. The storm had been a challenge, but it had been Susan's attitude that weighed the heaviest on her heart. She thought about her father, who had always encouraged her to dream big, to reach for the sky despite the obstacles in her way. He had faced his own challenges as a Navy pilot, but he had never let anyone tell him he didn't belong in the cockpit. He had passed that resilience down to Dana, teaching her that no matter what, she had the right to be exactly where she was. Dana smiled softly, thinking of the words he had told her so many years ago. "The sky belongs to everyone, but only the bold dare to own it." She had always been bold. She had dared to dream of flying when so many had told her it was possible. She had dared to push through the barriers placed in her way, never backing down from the challenges that came with being one of the few black women in her field. And today, She had risen above the doubts, the fear, and the prejudice, just as she always did. Dana stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. She knew there would be more storms ahead, both in the air and in her career. There would be more people like Susan Caldwell, people who questioned her abilities before even knowing her name. But Dana also knew that she had the strength to rise above it all. She had proven herself, not just to the world, but to herself. And that was what mattered. As she stood there, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Eric. "Tomorrow's flight is at 7 a. Mem. You ready for another adventure, Captain?" Dana smiled, her fingers tapping out a quick response. "Always." She set her phone down and looked out at the city once more, her heart filled with quiet pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready. She was always ready to fly. A few weeks later, Dana was sitting in her apartment, sipping her morning coffee and scrolling through the day's flight schedule when an unexpected letter arrived in her mailbox. It was a simple white envelope, addressed to her in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Curious, Dana opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The words were handwritten, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if the writer had paused several times while writing. "Dear Captain Brooks, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I was on the flight from Los Angeles to New York a few weeks ago, the one with the terrible storm. I was the woman who confronted you at the gate, the one who didn't think you were supposed to be the pilot. I've thought about that day a lot since then, and I realize now how wrong I was. I judged you unfairly, and I allowed my own ignorance to cloud my judgment. I can't even begin to imagine how hard you've worked to get where you are, and am sorry that I ever doubted you. You saved my life that day, Captain Brooks. You kept me and everyone else on that plane safe, and for that, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you my gratitude. Thank you for everything you did that day, for being calm in the storm, for keeping us safe, and for showing me that there is always more to someone than what we see on the surface. You'll never forget it. Sincerely, Susan Caldwell." Dana stared at the letter, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. She hadn't expected this a genuine apology, written in the same shaky hand that had once pointed fingers and cast doubt. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer beside her bed. It wasn't about changing the world all at once, but moments like this reminded her that change was possible, one person at a time. As Dana prepared for another day of flying, she smiled to herself, knowing that she had made a difference not just in the lives of her passengers, but in the heart of someone who had once doubted her. She had risen above just as she always did, and she would continue to do so, one flight at a time. If this story inspired you or made you think about resilience, strength, and overcoming life's challenges, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that highlight personal growth and the power of perseverance. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update, and if this story resonated with you, leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts. I'd love to hear your experiences, especially if you've ever faced a challenge where you had to rise above, just like Dana. Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter the turbulence, we can always find a way to soar higher. Others thought she had been too harsh, especially on Meyers, who had been popular among his peers for his assertiveness on the streets. Taylor, however, wasn't interested in being liked. Her job wasn't to win popularity contests, it was to lead. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing tension within the department. Rumors began to spread whispers that Taylor was too strict, too focused on changing things when, in the eyes of some officers, there wasn't much that needed changing. It was the classic resistance to reform, the same pushback she'd seen in departments all over the country. One morning, as Taylor made her way through the hallways, she overheard two officers talking in hushed tones near the break room. "I don't know, man," one of them said. "The chief's got it out for us. All this talk about accountability. It's like she doesn't trust us to do our jobs anymore. She's trying to turn this place into one of those departments you see on TV." The other officer muttered. "Next thing you know, we'll be handing out tickets for jaywalking." Taylor paused just out of sight, her chest tightening with frustration. It wasn't just the resistance to change that bothered her, it was the way they seemed to be missing the point entirely. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about making sure they understood their responsibility to the community, to the people they were supposed to protect and serve. That afternoon, Taylor called a meeting with Deputy Chief Michael Walker in her office. She needed to get a sense of how deep this divide ran, and more importantly, what she could do to bridge it if that was even possible. Walker sat across from her, his arms crossed, his usual calm demeanor slightly tense. He could sense the strain on her, the weight of leadership pressing down hard. "They're pushing back," Taylor said, not bothering with pleasantries. "They think I'm being too harsh." Walker raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" Taylor rubbed her temples. "I think I'm doing what needs to be done. But I also know that if I push too hard, I risk losing them entirely." Walker sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Change isn't easy, Taylor. You knew that when you took this job." "I did," Taylor agreed. "But knowing it and living it are two very different things." Walker studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You're right to hold them accountable. Meyers and Johnson needed to face consequences for what they did. But you've got to make sure the rest of the department doesn't see this as an attack. They need to understand that this is about making them better, not tearing them down." Taylor nodded, her gaze fixed on the papers scattered across her desk. "I don't want them to be afraid of me. I want them to respect me, and more importantly, I want them to respect the badge." "Respect is earned," Walker said quietly. "And you're earning it even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Taylor let out a long breath. "I hope you're right." It was just after 7 p.m. when the call came in. Taylor had barely sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee when her phone buzzed, interrupting the brief moment of peace she'd managed to carve out after another long day. The voice on the other end of the line was tense, sharp with urgency. "Chief, this is dispatch. We've got a hostage situation at a convenience store on the south side of town. A man's barricaded himself inside with 3 hostages." Taylor shot to her feet, her heart rate spiking. "Anyone injured?" "Not yet, but the suspect's armed and he's making threats. SWAT's been called, but they're 20 minutes out. You'll want to get here as soon as you can." "I'm on my way," Taylor replied, already grabbing her keys and heading for the door. The calm, peaceful evening was shattered as her mind switched into full gear. This was the kind of situation she'd trained for her whole career, but it was also the kind that could go wrong in the blink of an eye. As she raced through the streets of Brookwood, sirens wailing, her mind spun through everything that could go wrong. The suspect was desperate. Desperation made people dangerous. And if the officers on the scene didn't handle it carefully, things could escalate fast. But it wasn't just the situation she had to worry about. Her department was already on shaky ground. The tension from the investigation into Meyers and Johnson still lingered, and she knew some officers were questioning her leadership. This would be their first real test since the incident. How they handled it, and how she led them through it, would either bring them closer together or deepen the divide. She couldn't afford failure. When Taylor arrived at the scene, the red and blue lights of patrol cars flashed across the darkened street. Officers were positioned behind their vehicles, weapons drawn, while a small crowd of onlookers gathered at the edges, held back by caution tape. The convenience store loomed ahead, its windows dark, the neon open sign flickering ominously. Lieutenant Brian Mason approached her as soon as she stepped out of her car. His face was tense, but his voice steady as he gave her a quick rundown. "It's a guy named Marcus Langston, local small-time criminal, mostly petty theft. Apparently, he tried to rob the store, but things went south when the cashier fought back. He's got a gun and 3 people inside the cashier, a customer, and a teenager who walked in right before it all started." Taylor nodded, absorbing the information. "Any demands?" "Hez asking for a car to get out of town," Brian said. "Says if we don't give it to him, he'll start shooting." Taylor's jaw tightened. It was a classic situation: desperation, threats, and a man with nothing to lose. But there was something else. The teenager inside. If Langston got scared or angry, the situation could spiral out of control fast. "Have we made contact?" Taylor asked, her eyes scanning the scene. "We've been talking to him through the store's landline," Brian replied. "Hez agitated, but we've managed to keep him talking. So far, no one's hurt. Taylor felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The situation was still fragile. I want to talk to him. Brian's eyebrows shot up. You, Chief? We should wait for SWAT to get here. They're trained for this. Taylor shook her head. We don't have time. Every minute we wait, the more unstable this guy becomes. If we can keep him talking, we can buy ourselves more time to get those people out safely. Brian hesitated, clearly unsure, but finally nodded. All right, I'll set up the call. As Taylor moved to the mobile command unit, she couldn't help but notice the looks from some of the officers on the scene, some uncertain, others skeptical. This was the first real crisis they'd faced under her leadership, and it was clear not everyone was convinced she was making the right call. But she couldn't afford to doubt herself. Lives were on the line, and there was no room for hesitation. Sitting in the command unit, Taylor put on the headset. The line to the convenience store was already connected, and the faint sound of breathing echoed on the other end. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a man's voice, shaky but defiant, broke through. Who is this? Marcus Langston demanded. This is Chief Taylor Scott of the Brookwood Police Department, Taylor said, keeping her tone calm but firm. I understand you're in a tough spot right now, Marcus, but I want to help you get out of this safely. There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. Help me? How are you going to help me? I'm stuck in here, and if I walk out, you'll shoot me down like a dog. Taylor leaned forward, focusing on every word. She needed to build trust, to get him to see her as someone who could offer a way out. No one's getting shot, Marcus. That's not what we want. But I need you to help me too. Let's figure this out together, so no one gets hurt. Another silence. Then, Marcus' voice came through again, more agitated this time. I don't trust cops. You think I'm stupid I know how this end? Taylor's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not here to lie to you, Marcus. I'm here to tell you that there's a way for you to come out of this alive, with everyone safe. But you've got to work with me. A low growl of frustration came through the line. I didn't mean for it to go this way. It was supposed to be easy, just get in, get out. But now I'm screwed. Taylor seized on the vulnerability in his voice. I know you didn't mean for this to happen, Marcus. Things got out of control, but we can fix this. Let the hostages go, and we'll talk about getting you out of there safely. For a moment, there was only the sound of heavy breathing on the other end. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice breaking. I don't know if I can do that. They're all I've got. Taylor's mind raced. He was scared, cornered, and desperate. She had to convince him that letting the hostages go was his best option. Listen to me, Marcus. Holding those people inside isn't going to make this better. It's only going to make things worse. But if you let them go, we'll take that as a sign that you want to work with us. It's your first step toward making this right. Silence stretched again, and Taylor held her breath. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely audible. I'll let one of them go. Taylor's heart surged with hope. That's good, Marcus. That's a good first step. Who's coming out? The kid, Marcus replied. He doesn't deserve this. Taylor nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see her. All right, I'm sending an officer to the door. They'll take the kid to safety, okay? Marcus grunted in agreement. Taylor quickly relayed the instructions to Brian, who sent an officer forward. Minutes later, the door to the store creaked open, and a terrified teenager stumbled out, his eyes wide with fear. Taylor watched as the boy was rushed to safety, her heart pounding. It was a small victory, but they still had 2 more hostages inside. And Marcus Langston was far from stable. As the situation inside the store continued, Taylor's focus remained razor-sharp on the negotiation. Marcus was still talking, still teetering on the edge of panic and surrender. But they weren't out of the woods yet. Just as Taylor was about to respond to Marcus' latest demand, Brian's voice cut in through her earpiece. Chief, you're not going to believe this, but Meyers just showed up. Taylor blinked in surprise. Meyers has suspended. I know, Brian said, his tone incredulous. But he's here, and he says he can help. Says he knows Marcus personally used to bust him for petty crimes back in the day. Taylor's mind raced. Jared Meyers was the last person she expected to see tonight, especially given everything that had happened. But if what he was saying was true, if he knew Marcus Langston, Then maybe he could help de-escalate the situation. After a moment of hesitation, Taylor decided. Bring him in. Minutes later, Meyers stepped into the command unit, his face pale but determined. Taylor didn't know if it was desperation to prove himself after the recent suspension or genuine concern, but whatever it was, Meyers was here. And he might be the key to ending this standoff without bloodshed. Chief, Meyers said, his voice steady. I know Marcus. He's been in and out of trouble for years, but he's not a killer. He's scared, and I think I can talk him down. Taylor studied Meyers, searching for any sign of the arrogance that had defined him before. But all she saw was someone willing to step up, to make amends for past mistakes. She nodded. All right, Meyers, I'll let you talk to him. But if this goes south, I am pulling you out immediately. Meyers didn't argue. He took the headset and began talking to Marcus, his voice calm but firm. Marcus, it's Jared Meyers. You remember me? There was a long pause, then Marcus' voice crackled through the line, surprised but wary. Meyers, what the hell are you doing here? I'm here to help you, man, Meyers said. I know you didn't mean for things to go this way. I've seen you screw up before, but you've never hurt anyone. You don't want to start now? Marcus' voice wavered. I don't know, man. I don't know what to do. Meyers leaned forward, his tone becoming more urgent but still controlled. You let one of the hostages go. That was the right move. You're doing the right thing, Marcus. Just let the other two go, and we can figure this out. The tension in the command unit was palpable. Taylor watched Meyers closely, ready to jump in if needed, but so far he was handling it. And then, miraculously, Marcus agreed. Okay, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Okay, I'll let them go. Just don't shoot me. Meyers' voice softened. No one's going to shoot you, Marcus. Just walk out with your hands up, and we'll get you out of this safely. Taylor's heart pounded as the door to the convenience store opened again. The remaining hostages emerged first, followed by Marcus, his hands raised in surrender. Officers moved in quickly to take him into custody, but there was no violence, no gunfire. It was over. Taylor let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Against all odds, they had pulled it off. And Meyers, despite everything, had stepped up when it mattered most. After the scene cleared, Taylor found herself standing alone in the no-empty parking lot, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The crisis had ended peacefully, and for that, she was grateful. But what lingered in her mind wasn't just the success of the operation, it was Jared Meyers. She had been prepared to write him off as a reckless, arrogant cop who didn't belong in her department. But tonight, he had proven that he could do better, that he could be better. And in doing so, he had reminded her of why she had taken this job in the first place. People could change. Departments could change. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was possible. As Taylor watched Meyers talking with Brian and the other officers, she knew that tonight had been a turning point. Not just for Meyers, but for the entire department. Trust had been broken in the past, but tonight had begun to mend it, piece by piece. It wouldn't be the last crisis they faced, and there were still officers in the department who resisted the changes Taylor was pushing for. But for the first time in a long while, Taylor felt something she hadn't felt since the day she was appointed chief. Hope. The morning after the hostage situation, the atmosphere at the Brookwood Police Department felt different. There was still the usual hustle and bustle as officers prepared for their daily briefings and filed their reports. But underneath it all, there was a quiet buzz sense of something having shifted overnight. Taylor sat at her desk, reviewing the final report on Marcus Langston's arrest. It had been a close call, but they had managed to resolve it peacefully, and all the hostages had made it out safely. More importantly, the way the department had handled the situation had marked a turning point. Officers who had once been divided over Taylor's leadership now seemed to see her in a different light. Just as she finished reading through the report, there was a knock on her door. It was Lieutenant Brian Mason, as steady as ever, but today his expression was lighter, almost relieved. "Chief, just wanted to give you a heads up. Word about last night's incident is spreading through the department," Brian said, stepping inside. "And it's good news this time. People are talking about how well things went. Meyers stepping up really surprised a lot of folks. Taylor leaned back in her chair, feeling the tension she hadn't realized she was holding begin to melt away. "What's the general sentiment?" she asked, knowing how important the officer's trust was to the department's cohesion. Brian sat down across from her, rubbing the back of his neck thoughtfully. "Honestly, I think last night changed a lot of minds. There's been a lot of talk about how you handled the negotiation and how you brought Meyers in, even though he's suspended. They're seeing you as more than just the person cracking down on them. They're seeing a leader who's willing to trust her people even after mistakes." Taylor considered his words, her mind flashing back to the moment when Meyers had shown up. She had taken a gamble by letting him help, but it had paid off. More than that, it had allowed the department to see that redemption and growth were possible, even for someone like Meyers, who had been on the wrong path. "That's good to hear," Taylor said, though she tempered her relief. "But we're not done yet. The real challenge will be keeping this momentum going. We can't let one good night undo the work we still need to do." Brian nodded in agreement. "I think people are starting to get that. You've got more allies than you realize, Chief." Taylor smiled at that, a small but genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the department wasn't just surviving. It was starting to thrive. Later that afternoon, Taylor called Jared Meyers into her office. His suspension was still in effect, but after last night, she knew they needed to talk. Meyers entered the room with a cautious expression, as if unsure of what was coming. He stood at attention, waiting for her to speak. "Have a seat, Officer Meyers," Taylor said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Meyers sat down, but he didn't look entirely comfortable. There was still a lingering wariness in his eyes, a trace of the arrogance she had once seen in him, now replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you for your help last night," Taylor began, watching his reaction closely. "You stepped up when it mattered, and because of that, we were able to end the situation peacefully." Meyers looked down at his hands, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Chief. I knew Marcus. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Taylor studied him for a moment before continuing. "You did the right thing. But I also want you to understand that what you did doesn't erase your past mistakes. You're still suspended, and when you come back, you'll still be required to complete your retraining. The way you handled yourself last night shows that you've got potential, but it also shows that you need to make that your standard, not the exception." Meyers' shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. "I get that. I'm not going to make excuses for what happened before. I messed up, but I'm trying to do better. That's all I can ask," Taylor said, her tone softening just a little. "But understand this, Meyers earning back trust isn't something that happens overnight. You'll have to prove yourself, not just to me, but to the entire department." "I will," Meyers said, meeting her gaze. "I know I've got a long way to go, but I want to make things right." Taylor could see the sincerity in his eyes. Maybe he really had learned from his mistakes. Only time would tell if he could maintain that growth, but for now, she was willing to give him the chance. "Good," Taylor said, standing up and offering her hand. "Well, see where you are when you finish your retraining." Meyers shook her hand, his grip firm but respectful. "Thank you, Chief." As Meyers left her office, Taylor allowed herself a moment to reflect. This was what leadership was about, not just making the tough calls, but also giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes. It wasn't easy, and it didn't always pay off. But sometimes it did, and that was enough to keep her going. The department was buzzing with activity the next morning as Taylor made her rounds. There was still plenty of work cases to solve, reports to file, training to conduct, but the undercurrent of division that had plagued the department for so long seemed to be fading. Taylor walked past Officer Eric Johnson, who was busy filing paperwork at the front desk. He looked up as she passed, his face still marked by the guilt and shame of his involvement in the Meyers incident. But instead of avoiding her gaze like he had in the days following his suspension, he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Taylor paused, offering him a quick but meaningful smile. "How's it going, Johnson?" Johnson swallowed, straightening up. "Good, Chief. Just trying to catch up on some of the reports I missed while I was out." "You're doing a good job," Taylor said, her tone light but sincere. "Keep it up." Johnson nodded again, the weight of his past mistakes still visible on his shoulders, but there was also a flicker of hope. He wasn't the most confident officer, but he was learning, slowly but surely. As Taylor continued down the hallway, she saw more faces, some familiar, some new, but all of them were starting to look at her with a different kind of respect. Not the forced respect that came from a title or a position of power, but the kind that was earned over time through actions, through consistency. By the time Taylor reached the briefing room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: optimism. The department was still far from perfect, but it was changing. And for the first time, Taylor believed that the change was real and lasting. Several weeks later, Taylor stood on the steps of the Brookwood Town Hall, the autumn air crisp and cool around her. A small crowd had gathered in the square, a mix of local residents, officers from her department, and a few members of the media. The hostage situation had garnered a lot of attention, and the town's leaders had organized a small event to recognize the police department's efforts in resolving it peacefully. Taylor had been asked to speak, and as she stood in front of the microphone, she could see the expectant faces of the crowd watching her. She took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank you all for being here today. It means a lot to me and to the entire Brookwood Police Department to have your support." There was a smattering of applause, and Taylor smiled, feeling the warmth of the community's approval. But she wasn't here to bask in praise. She was here to speak the truth. Last month, we faced a serious crisis. A man's life was in danger, along with the lives of 3 innocent hostages. But because of the bravery and dedication of the officers in this department, we were able to bring that situation to a peaceful resolution. More applause, but Taylor held up her hand to quiet the crowd. "But I want to be clear," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "That situation wasn't just about one night. It was about the trust we've been building slowly, day by day, between this department and the people of this town.
Trust isn't something that comes easily.
It's something we have to earn, not just once, but every day." She glanced out at the crowd, her gaze settling on a few familiar faces, members of the community who had been skeptical of her leadership when she first arrived. People who had questioned her ability to lead, to bridge the gap between the department and the town it served. "Brookwood has had its share of challenges," Taylor said, her voice rising slightly. "And so has this department. But what you've shown is that when we work together, when we listen to each other, we can overcome those challenges. We can build something stronger, something better." The applause this time was louder, more heartfelt. Taylor smiled, feeling the energy of the crowd wash over her. For the first time since she had taken the job as chief of police, she felt like she wasn't just leading a department. She was part of a community that was finally starting to trust her and the officers under her command. As the applause died down, Taylor stepped away from the microphone, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She knew there were still challenges ahead. Reform didn't happen overnight, and there would always be obstacles. But for the first time, she felt confident that they could meet those challenges head-on together. That evening, Taylor sat on her front porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, and the cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. It was peaceful, something she hadn't allowed herself to enjoy in far too long. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Deputy Chief Michael Walker. Walker heard about the event. "Sounds like things are finally turning around. Proud of you, Taylor." Taylor smiled as she typed a response. "Taylor couldn't have done it without you." As she set the phone down, Taylor let herself relax, the weight of the past few months finally lifting. The department had faced its struggles, and there was still plenty of work to do. But they were moving forward, and that was all she could ask for. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more crises to manage. But for now, Taylor allowed herself to savor this small victory. Because for the first time in a long time, she knew they were heading in the right direction. And that made all the difference. Thank you for watching and following the journey of Chief Taylor Scott as she navigates the challenges of leadership and justice. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more compelling narratives like this one, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more stories lined up that explore courage, growth, and the power of change, just like this one. Your support helps us keep bringing you content that matters. Thanks again, and see you in the next story. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard. As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the community safety initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan. "Still waiting on you, old man." Time's ticking. Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. "I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game." With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The national pilot program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched as communities began to embrace the new model as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the national pilot program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. "Well, old man, we did it." Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. "Yeah, we did." They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as Chief of Police and had successfully completed his work on the National Pilot Program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, he gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their two grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest piqued. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.